Welcome back to Wild HOA Situations. I thought it would be a warning. It was a cover-up. Sandra pointed at the board roster pinned to the clubhouse corkboard and screamed that names were private. "You are not allowed to ignore me," she snapped, stepping into my space with a laminated sheet already lifted like a shield. I stood in the narrow clubhouse hallway with my phone recording in my hand, a plastic-sleeved rule packet folded in my other, and the awareness that this was the third time in 2 months she had moved the target after I cleared the last one. I am a warehouse inventory controller, which means I track every item and timestamp for a living, and right now every instinct I had was telling me Sandra Campbell was not operating off standard policy. She was running her own playbook, and she had done this before. The Heights at Summit Ridge Association sits in Portland, Oregon, a neighborhood where the compliance chair carries a clipboard like a badge and residents joke that you need a permit to sneeze. I moved here because the lease addendum tied directly to HOA compliance, and one black mark on the record could trigger an eviction clause my landlord was all too happy to enforce. Sandra knew that. She had known it the first time she knocked, and she had known it the second time she left a notice I never saw until it was already overdue. This started 3 weeks ago when my doorbell camera caught someone placing a violation slip at 11:30 at night and walking away fast. The timestamp was clear. The face was not, but the gait and the badge reel swinging from the waistband were enough. The notice claimed my trash bin had been left out past collection hours 2 days prior, which was impossible, because I was at work until 6 and the bins were already pulled back by the time I got home. I uploaded a rebuttal to the HOA portal that same night with the doorbell clip attached. The portal gave me a confirmation number. 2 days later, Sandra sent an email saying the portal had no record of my submission and I was being fined $50 for non-compliance and another $25 for a late response. I called the management company. The woman on the phone sounded tired and said she would look into it. 3 days after that, Sandra showed up at my door with a printed packet and said the fine was now $150 because I had ignored 2 reminders. I asked what reminders. She tapped the packet with 1 manicured nail and said they were sent via the portal and it was my responsibility to check daily. I checked my portal account on my phone right there in front of her. Nothing. She smiled and said the system must have flagged my account for suspicious activity and I should contact support. Then she told me I had 72 hours to pay, or the account would be referred to collections and a lien placed on the property. That was when I started digging. I am good at tracking discrepancies, and Sandra had just handed me a whole stack of them. The packet she gave me had a date stamp 3 days earlier than the email she claimed was the first reminder. The formatting did not match any other HOA correspondence I had received. The signature line at the bottom was a scanned image, not a live signature, and when I zoomed in on my phone I could see the pixel edges were identical to a signature on a completely different notice I had gotten 4 months ago about a parking sticker. Someone was reusing templates, backdating them, and printing them on demand. I went to the clubhouse the next morning and asked to see the violation log. The front desk clerk, a man in his 60s with reading glasses on a chain, said I needed to submit a records request in writing. I asked if I could submit it right there. He handed me a form. I filled it out, dated it, signed it, and handed it back. He stamped it with a manual date stamp, gave me a copy, and said I would have a response within 10 business days per state law. I thanked him and left. Sandra called me that afternoon. She said the records request had been flagged because it was overly broad and I needed to resubmit with specific date ranges and document types. I told her the form did not have fields for that, and I had followed the template provided by the clerk. She said the clerk was not trained on compliance requests and I needed to use the updated form, which she would email me. I asked why the updated form was not available at the front desk. She said it was pending board approval, and I was lucky she was giving me early access. I asked when the board had voted to change the form. She said that was confidential. The email arrived 20 minutes later. The form was a Word document with fillable fields, and one of those fields was labeled Justification for Request. I printed it, filled it out by hand with the exact same information as the original request, scanned it, and emailed it back. Sandra replied within an hour saying the justification was insufficient and I needed to provide a legal basis for accessing private HOA records. I replied with a copy of Oregon Revised Statutes Section 94.670, which gives homeowners and tenants the right to inspect association records during normal business hours with 72 hours notice. She did not reply. 2 days later, a tow truck showed up in my driveway at 6 a.m. The driver knocked, and I opened the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt to see a flatbed idling and a hook already extended toward my car. I asked what was happening. He handed me a work order with my address, my license plate, and a signature I had never seen before authorizing the tow for an expired registration sticker. My registration was current. I showed him my phone with the DMV app open and my valid registration displayed. He squinted at it, looked back at the work order and said he was just following the call. I asked who called it in. He said the HOA. I stepped outside in bare feet and asked him to wait. He shrugged and leaned against the truck. I went back inside, pulled up my doorbell footage from the night before, and found Sandra walking up my driveway at 10:45, stopping in front of my car, taking a photo with her phone, and walking back to the street where a sedan with no visible plates was waiting. I showed the driver the clip. He watched it, handed me back my phone and said he was not getting in the middle of this. Then, he retracted the hook, got in the truck, and left. I called the tow company. The dispatcher said the order had come through their HOA contract line and included a signed authorization form. I asked for a copy. She said she could not release it without a formal request. I asked how to make a formal request. She gave me an email address. I sent the request immediately, CC'd the management company and Sandra, and attached the doorbell clip with a note that said the authorization was fraudulent and I was filing a complaint with the state. Sandra showed up 30 minutes later. She parked in front of my house, got out holding a folded rule packet in a plastic sleeve, and walked up the driveway like she owned it. I was still outside in a hoodie I had thrown on over the t-shirt, phone in hand, recording. She stopped 10 feet away and said I was in violation of the guest parking policy for allowing an unauthorized commercial vehicle to idle in the fire lane. I pointed out that the tow truck was gone and the fire lane was the street, not my driveway. She said the driveway was part of the common area and required a permit for any service vehicle. I asked where that was written. She unfolded the packet and held it up, angled so I could not read it. I asked her to let me see it. She said I could request a copy through the portal. I said I had already requested records 2 days ago and she had not responded. She said the request was under review and I would be notified when it was approved or denied. I asked her why she had authorized a tow for a car with valid registration. She said she had not authorized anything and I was deflecting from my own violations. I held up my phone with the doorbell clip cued. She glanced at it, and I saw her jaw tighten. Then she said doorbell footage was not admissible without written consent from all parties and I was violating Oregon wiretap laws by recording her. I said Oregon is a one-party consent state and I was a party to this conversation. She said I was harassing her and she was filing a complaint with the board. Then she turned and walked back to her car. I stood there with my phone still recording until she drove away. Then I went inside, uploaded the clip to 3 separate cloud accounts, and started making a list. Sandra had now blocked my records request, changed the form requirements mid-process, threatened me with a lien, called in a fraudulent tow, and accused me of harassment. That was 5 distinct moves in 3 weeks, and every one of them had been designed to either cost me money or create a paper trail that would justify future enforcement. I had a lease addendum that made me vulnerable, and she knew it. But I also had timestamps, recordings, and a pattern that was starting to look less like overzealous enforcement and more like a targeted campaign. I opened my laptop and started searching old Nextdoor posts for the neighborhood. It took about 10 minutes to find the first mention of Sandra. A user with a fake name had posted 8 months ago asking if anyone else had been fined for violations they did not commit. 3 people replied saying yes. One of them mentioned a tow that had been called in without authorization. Another mentioned a records request that had been denied, and then the fine had doubled. The thread had 17 replies before it was locked by a moderator, with a note that said the HOA had requested the discussion be moved to private channels. I kept digging. I found a deleted post from 6 months ago, archived on a neighborhood blog, where someone claimed Sandra had backdated a violation notice to justify a late fee, and the board had upheld it without reviewing the evidence. The poster said they had moved out rather than fight it. I found another post from 4 months ago where a resident said they had filed a complaint with the state, and the HOA attorney had sent them a cease and desist letter. I found a third post from 2 months ago where someone said their records request had been partially fulfilled, with half the pages redacted and no explanation. That was the cold case. Sandra had been running this operation for at least 8 months, and based on the pattern, she had been targeting people who were vulnerable, renters with lease addendums, new owners who did not know the rules, people who worked nights or traveled for work and could not attend meetings. She would pick a violation, real or invented, escalate it faster than anyone could respond, and then bury them in procedural delays until they either paid or left. The board either did not know or did not care, and the management company was not paid enough to investigate. I needed proof that connected the dots, and I needed it before Sandra escalated again. My phone storage was almost full, and I had to back up video evidence before it got lost, so I spent the next hour offloading everything to an external drive and labeling the files with dates and descriptions. Then I went back to the clubhouse. The clerk was at the desk again. I asked if there was a way to see the board meeting minutes for the last year. He said they were posted on the HOA website under the members-only section. I logged in on my phone. The minutes page had links for the last 6 months, but when I clicked on anything older than March, I got a 404 error. I asked the clerk if there was a hard copy archive. He said yes, in the back office, but I would need board approval to access it. I asked how to get board approval. He said I would need to submit a written request to the board president. I asked who that was. He said Sandra Campbell. I thanked him and left. I sat in my car for 5 minutes staring at the steering wheel trying to figure out my next move. Then I got a text from a number I did not recognize. It said, "I saw your records request. Call me." I called. A woman answered and said her name was Monica. She lived 3 streets over and she had been through the same thing with Sandra a year ago. She said she had documentation, and if I was serious about fighting this, she would meet me. We met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the neighborhood entrance. Monica was in her 40s, calm, and carrying a manila folder that looked like it had been through a war. She sat down, opened the folder, and slid a stack of printouts across the table. Bank statements showing HOA fines. Emails from Sandra with contradictory instructions. A records request response that had been partially fulfilled with pages missing. And a printed copy of board meeting minutes from 11 months ago with a handwritten note in the margin that said original version, not the one posted online. Monica said she had attended that meeting in person and taken notes. After the meeting, the official minutes were posted online with 3 motions removed and 2 votes flipped. She had filed a complaint with the management company, and the attorney had replied saying the minutes were subject to board approval and corrections were routine. She had escalated to the state, and the state had told her to pursue it in small claims court. She had decided it was not worth the fight and had moved out 6 months later. But she had kept the folder, and when she saw my name on the records request log at the clubhouse, she recognized the pattern. I asked her how she had accessed the records request log. She said she had not. She said a neighbor who worked the front desk part-time had mentioned it in passing because he was worried about retaliation. That neighbor was the same clerk I had talked to, and he had been keeping his own informal tally of how many requests Sandra had blocked or slow-walked. Monica said he did not want to go public, but he was willing to be a witness if it came to that. I asked Monica what the 3 removed motions were. She flipped to a highlighted page. One motion had been to require the compliance chair to log all violation notices in a shared database with timestamps. Another had been to set a maximum fine amount without board review. The third had been to require the management company to independently verify any tow authorization. All 3 had passed with a majority vote. None of them appeared in the posted minutes, and none of them had ever been implemented. I asked Monica if she still had her original notes from the meeting. She said yes, at home. I asked if she would be willing to scan them and send them to me. She said she would do better than that. She pulled out her phone, opened her photos, and showed me a picture she had taken of the attendance sheet that night. Sandra had signed in as compliance chair. The board president at the time had been someone else, and the attorney had been present, which meant the minutes alteration had happened after the fact, with or without the attorney's knowledge. I asked Monica if she knew why the board president had changed. She said he had resigned abruptly 4 months after that meeting, citing personal reasons. Sandra had been appointed acting president by a majority vote, and the election to confirm her had been postponed twice. She was still acting president now 10 months later, with no election scheduled. My phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. It said, "Your records request has been denied due to insufficient justification. Per HOA policy, you may appeal to the board at the next scheduled meeting. The next meeting is in 6 weeks." I showed Monica the screen. She smiled, but it was not a happy smile. She said that was the same move Sandra had pulled on her, and by the time the meeting happened, the statute of limitations on the original fine would have expired, and the account would already be in collections. I asked Monica if she had any advice. She said yes. Do not wait for the meeting. Go over Sandra's head. Contact the management company attorney directly. Send everything you have and CC the board members you can identify from the old minutes. Force the attorney to either defend the altered minutes or distance the company from Sandra's actions. Either way, you break the logjam. And do it fast, because Sandra has already shown she will escalate. I thanked Monica, took photos of every page in her folder, and left. I spent the rest of the afternoon drafting an email to the management company attorney. I attached the doorbell footage, the tow work order, the 2 different records request forms, the email chain with Sandra, Monica's meeting minutes comparison, and a timeline that showed every escalation step. I CC'd the 4 board members I could identify from the old attendance sheet, plus the management company general email and the state HOA ombudsman. The subject line was, "Formal complaint regarding compliance chair conduct and potential records tampering." I read it 3 times, checked every attachment, and hit send. Sandra called me an hour later. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying I had violated the dispute resolution policy by contacting board members directly, and I was now subject to additional fines for harassment and defamation. She said she had forwarded my email to the HOA attorney and they would be pursuing legal action. Her voice was tight, clipped, and just barely under control. I saved the voicemail and added it to my evidence folder. The management company attorney replied the next morning. The email was 3 sentences. It said, "My complaint had been received, it was under review, and I should expect a response within 10 business days." It did not acknowledge any of the attachments. It did not promise any action. It was the kind of reply that meant someone was buying time to figure out what to do. 2 days later, I got a notice taped to my door. It said I was in violation of the noise ordinance for operating power tools after 9 p.m. I do not own power tools. I work night shifts, and I am usually not even home after 9. I checked my doorbell footage. The notice had been placed at 7:30 in the morning by Sandra, and the timestamp on the printed notice itself was backdated to 2 days prior. She was escalating, and she was getting sloppy. I called Monica. She said the noise violation was a new one, and it meant Sandra was running out of moves. The trash, the parking, the tow, those were all semi-plausible. A noise complaint for something that never happened was desperation. Monica said to document it, add it to the evidence file, and wait for Sandra to make the next mistake. She also said to check the HOA vendor list, because if Sandra was authorizing fraudulent tows, she probably had a relationship with the tow company that was not on the books. I pulled up the HOA website and found the vendor page. The tow company was listed along with a landscaping service, a pool contractor, and a security patrol company. I called the tow company back and asked to speak to a supervisor. I got a man who sounded annoyed and said he remembered my case. I asked if the HOA had a contract that included a commission or referral fee for tows. He said he could not discuss contract terms. I asked if he could confirm whether Sandra Campbell was an authorized contact. He paused, then said she was listed as primary contact for compliance enforcement and he had her signature on file for multiple authorizations. I asked how many. He said he could not give me an exact number without a formal request, but it was more than a dozen in the last 6 months. I thanked him and hung up. More than a dozen tows in 6 months from one HOA with maybe 300 units. That was not normal enforcement. That was a pattern, and it was generating revenue for the tow company and giving Sandra leverage to collect fines and fees. If the contract included any kind of per-tow payment to the HOA or to Sandra, personally, it was a textbook conflict of interest. I sent a follow-up email to the attorney asking for a copy of the HOA tow company contract under the same public records statute I had cited before. I CC'd the same list. Then I sent a separate email to the tow company supervisor asking for a copy of any authorizations signed by Sandra Campbell in the last year, citing my rights as an affected party. I did not expect either of them to comply immediately, but I wanted the requests on record. The next day, Sandra sent me a new notice. This one said I was being fined $300 for submitting frivolous records requests and harassing HOA vendors. The notice included a citation to a section of the HOA covenants I had never seen before, and when I looked it up in my copy of the governing documents, the section number did not exist. I texted Monica a photo. She called me back within 5 minutes and said Sandra had just invented a rule. Monica said this was the moment to push. Sandra was now making moves that were not just aggressive but legally indefensible, and that meant the attorney would have to either disavow her or double down. Monica said to file a formal bar complaint against the attorney if he did not respond within the statutory window, and to send a copy of the invented rule citation to the state ombudsman with a request for an emergency review. I did both. The bar complaint was a long shot, but it put the attorney on notice that I was serious. The ombudsman request was faster and had teeth, because Oregon law gives the ombudsman authority to investigate HOA governance violations and issue binding recommendations. I attached every piece of evidence I had, including the backdated notices, the altered minutes comparison, the fraudulent tow authorization, and the invented rule citation. The complaint form asked for a summary of harm. I wrote, "The compliance chair has systematically targeted me with fraudulent violations. blocked my access to records, and invented rules to justify escalating fines. This is part of a pattern affecting multiple residents over at least 8 months, and I have documentation showing the HOA board has either enabled or ignored the abuse. I submitted the form online and got an auto reply saying someone would contact me within 5 business days. That gave me a ticking clock. If Sandra escalated again before I heard back, I was going to run out of time to stop a lien or a collections referral. My lease addendum was clear. Any unresolved HOA violation that resulted in a lien or legal action was grounds for immediate eviction. My landlord would not wait for me to win an appeal. Sandra must have known the clock was running, because 2 days later I got a call from a lawyer I had never heard of. He said he represented the HOA in collections matters and my account was overdue in the amount of $875, including fines, late fees, and administrative costs. He said I had 72 hours to pay in full, or a lien would be filed against the property. I asked for an itemized statement. He said it had been mailed to my address of record. I said I had not received anything. He said that was not his problem and the clock was running. I asked for his name, his bar number, and his firm. He gave me all 3. I wrote them down, thanked him, and hung up. Then I looked him up. He was a real attorney, but his practice area was debt collection, not HOA law. That meant Sandra had gone outside the management company and hired a collections lawyer directly, which was either a huge overreach or a sign that the management company had cut her loose. I called Monica. She said hiring an outside collections attorney without board approval was a violation of the HOA governing documents and possibly a breach of fiduciary duty. She said to email the management company attorney immediately and ask whether the board had authorized the collections referral. If they had not, Sandra was acting alone, and that made her personally liable. I sent the email. I also sent a copy to the collections attorney with a note that said I was disputing the debt under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, and I required validation of every charge before I would discuss payment. That gave me another 30 days under federal law, and it forced the collections attorney to either produce real documentation or drop the case. The management company attorney replied within 2 hours. The email was longer this time. It said the board had not authorized collections. Sandra Campbell had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, and all enforcement actions under her authority were suspended. It said I should disregard any further communications from Sandra and direct all questions to the management company. It also said my records request was being expedited, and I would receive a response within 48 hours. I read the email twice to make sure I was not misreading it. Sandra was out. The investigation was real, and I was about to get the records I had been asking for since the beginning. I forwarded the email to Monica with a note that said we did it. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji and the word almost. She was right. Sandra was on leave, but that did not mean she was done, and it did not mean the records would show what I needed them to show. The records arrived 2 days later in a PDF with 243 pages. Board meeting minutes, violation logs, records request responses, tow authorizations, and vendor contracts. I spent 6 hours going through them with a notepad and 3 colors of highlighter. The patterns were everywhere. 16 tow authorizations in 6 months, all signed by Sandra. 10 of them for vehicles with current registration. 42 violation notices issued in the same period, 27 of them to the same 8 residents. And 6 records requests that had been denied or delayed, all from people who had disputed fines. But the smoking gun was in the meeting minutes. Monica had been right. The minutes from 11 months ago had been altered after posting. The original version, included in the records dump as a scanned PDF with a different file name, showed the 3 motions that had passed and been removed. It also showed a 4th motion that had failed, a motion to grant the compliance chair unilateral authority to issue fines up to $500 without board review. Sandra had proposed that motion. It had failed 4-1. And then she had done it anyway. I did not chase her accusations, because I already had the receipts. The records request response had given me everything I needed to prove Sandra had been operating outside her authority, altering official documents, and targeting residents in a way that generated fees for the HOA and leverage for her personal enforcement agenda. The question now was what to do with it. Monica called me that night. She said the word was spreading in the neighborhood. 3 people had reached out to her after seeing the management company email about Sandra's suspension, and all 3 had stories. One had been towed twice in the same month. Another had been fined for a mailbox color that matched the approved pallet. A third had been threatened with a lien after requesting copies of the HOA budget. Monica said they were talking about forming a group to demand an election, and they wanted me to lead it. I told her I was not interested in running for the board. I just wanted Sandra out and my record cleared. Monica said that was fine, but the group still needed someone who had the documentation and the credibility to stand up at a meeting and make the case. I said I would think about it. 2 days later, I got another call from the management company attorney. He said the internal investigation had concluded, Sandra Campbell had been removed from all HOA positions, and the board was scheduling an emergency meeting to elect a new president and compliance chair. He said I was invited to attend and present my findings if I wanted to. He also said the HOA would be refunding all fines assessed by Sandra in the last 12 months and issuing a formal apology to affected residents. He did not say whether Sandra would face any legal consequences, and I did not ask. That was someone else's fight. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. I spent the weekend putting together a presentation. I did not have slides or a projector, but I had a 3-ring binder with tabs, printed evidence, and a timeline that fit on 2 pages. Monica agreed to come as my witness, and 2 of the other affected residents said they would be there as well. The night before the meeting, Sandra called me. I almost did not answer, but I was recording everything now, so I picked up and put it on speaker. She did not say hello. She said, "You do not know what you have done." I said I knew exactly what I had done. She said the HOA was a volunteer organization and people like me who weaponized the system were the reason no one wanted to serve. I said people like her were the reason residents did not trust the board. She said I would regret this. And then she hung up. I saved the recording and added it to the binder. Tuesday came. I got to the clubhouse at 6:45 and found Monica already there with the 2 other residents. The room was set up with a folding table at the front and about 30 chairs in rows. By 7, 20 people had shown up, which was more than I expected. The acting board president, a man I had never met, called the meeting to order and said they would start with public comment. I stood up, walked to the front, and set my binder on the table. I introduced myself, said I was a resident and a tenant, and said I was here to present evidence of systematic abuse by the former compliance chair. I opened the binder to the first tab and started talking. I kept it factual. I showed the altered meeting minutes, the backdated notices, the fraudulent tow authorizations, and the vendor contract with the per-tow fee. I showed the timeline of how Sandra had escalated against me and at least 7 other residents over the last year. I showed the emails where she had invented rules, blocked records requests, and threatened legal action. And I showed the final piece, a comparison of the meeting minutes she had posted online versus the original scanned version in the records dump, with the 3 removed motions highlighted in yellow. I did not editorialize. I did not call her names. I just put the evidence on the table and said, this is what happened, this is the pattern, and this is why the board needs to implement the 3 motions that were passed a year ago and never enforced. When I finished, the room was quiet. The acting president asked if anyone had questions. One of the other affected residents stood up and said she had been towed twice and fined 3 times, and she wanted to know if the board had known what Sandra was doing. The acting president said the board had not been aware of the scope of the issue until the management company attorney flagged it last week. Someone else asked if Sandra would face criminal charges. The acting president said that was a question for law enforcement, and the board was not involved in that decision. Monica stood up and said she wanted to add one thing. She pulled out the folder she had brought to the coffee shop and held up the original handwritten notes from the meeting 11 months ago. She said she had been at that meeting, she had watched the board pass 3 motions designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse I had just documented, and she had watched those motions disappear from the official record. She said the board owed the neighborhood an explanation for how that had happened, and what they were going to do to make sure it did not happen again. The acting president looked uncomfortable. He said the board took full responsibility for the oversight, and they would be reviewing all compliance procedures going forward. He said the 3 motions would be reintroduced and voted on at the next regular meeting, and in the meantime, all enforcement actions were suspended except for genuine health and safety violations. Someone in the back asked what would happen to Sandra. The acting president said she had been removed from all positions and was no longer authorized to act on behalf of the HOA. He said the board had referred the matter to the management company attorney and they were exploring all available remedies. That was lawyer speak for "we are hoping this goes away quietly." The meeting went on for another 40 minutes. People asked questions, shared their own stories, and vented frustration. The acting president mostly nodded and promised to look into things. When it was over, Monica and I walked out together. She said it went as well as it could have gone, and now the question was whether the board would actually follow through or just wait for people to forget. I said I was not going to let them forget. I had the binder, I had the recordings, and I had a group of residents who were ready to hold the board accountable. Monica said that was good, because HOAs only changed when people made them. 2 weeks later, the board held the revote on the 3 motions. All 3 passed unanimously, and the new compliance chair was a retired paralegal who had been one of Sandra's targets. The management company sent out an email announcing the changes and apologizing to affected residents. My fines were refunded in full, and the tow company sent me a separate apology letter along with a check for $200 to cover my time and inconvenience. I did not ask where the money came from, but I assumed the HOA had negotiated the refund as part of canceling the contract. Sandra disappeared. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved out of state, but I never confirmed it. Her name stopped appearing on any HOA communications, and the new compliance chair operated with a level of transparency and professionalism that felt almost surreal after months of Sandra's tactics. I kept the binder. I updated it with the board's apology, the refund documentation, and the final meeting minutes showing the revote. I also kept the recordings, the doorbell footage, and Monica's folder. Not because I thought I would need them again, but because I wanted a record of what had happened and how it had been fixed. A month after the revote, I got a thank you card in the mail from one of the residents who had been at the meeting. It said she had been fighting the HOA for 2 years over a bogus fine, and my presentation had given her the courage to reopen her case. She said the board had reviewed it, found the fine was invalid, and refunded her money. She said she was grateful, and she hoped I knew how much it mattered. I did know. I had spent months feeling like I was fighting alone, and then I had found Monica, and then I had found the others, and together we had forced the system to work the way it was supposed to. It was not a dramatic victory. There was no courtroom showdown, no viral video, no front-page story. Just a binder, a group of people who refused to be bullied, and a board that finally did the right thing when they had no other choice. The lease addendum that had been hanging over me the whole time turned out to be a non-issue. My landlord never mentioned it, and when I checked my tenant portal a few weeks later, I saw a note that said HOA compliance verified, no action required. I did not know if the management company had sent him an update or if he had just decided it was not worth pursuing. But either way, I was clear. Monica and I stayed in touch. She introduced me to the neighborhood group she had been talking about, and I went to a few meetings. We talked about running candidates in the next board election, pushing for a full audit of HOA finances, and creating a resident handbook that actually explained the rules in plain language. I did not want to be the face of the group, but I was happy to help behind the scenes. I was good with documents, timelines, and evidence, and that turned out to be exactly what the group needed. The new compliance chair reached out to me a few months later and asked if I would be willing to serve on a compliance oversight committee. I said yes, as long as the role was advisory and did not require me to enforce anything. She said that was fine, and the committee's job was just to review violation notices before they were issued and make sure they were supported by the rules. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of check that would have stopped Sandra before she ever got started. I took the role. The committee met once a month, and we reviewed about a dozen notices per meeting. Most of them were legitimate, overgrown landscaping, trash bins left out for days, cars parked in fire lanes. But every so often we would catch something that did not quite add up. A violation notice with a backdated timestamp, a fine that cited a rule section that did not exist, a tow authorization for a vehicle that was legally parked. We would flag it, send it back to the compliance chair, and the notice would be withdrawn. It was not glamorous work, but it mattered. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmares and satisfying payback. One afternoon, about 6 months after Sandra's removal, I was walking to my car when I saw her. She was parked across the street in a sedan I did not recognize, and she was staring at my building. I stopped, and we made eye contact. She did not get out. She did not wave. She just sat there for about 10 seconds, and then she drove away. I pulled out my phone and got her plate number just in case, but she never came back. I mentioned it to Monica, and she said Sandra was probably just driving through and saw me by coincidence. I was not sure I believed that, but I did not pursue it. The neighborhood settled into a new normal. The compliance committee became a permanent fixture. The board held regular elections. The management company replaced the attorney with someone who actually responded to emails. And the residents started showing up to meetings, not because there was a crisis, but because they wanted to make sure there would not be another one. I kept my binder in a file box in my closet along with the external drive that had all the recordings and doorbell footage. I did not look at it often, but I knew it was there. Every so often, someone from the neighborhood would reach out with a question about HOA rules or enforcement, and I would pull out the binder and walk them through it. I was not a lawyer, and I was not an expert, but I had lived through the fight, and that made me useful. The tow company story had a coda. About 8 months after Sandra's suspension, I got a call from the supervisor I had talked to before. He said the company had done an internal audit after the HOA canceled the contract, and they had found irregularities in multiple accounts, not just ours. He said Sandra had been signing authorizations for tows without board approval at 3 other HOAs in the metro area, and the company had referred the matter to the state attorney general for investigation. He said he could not give me details, but he wanted me to know that my complaint had started the process. I thanked him and wished him luck. I never found out what happened with the AG investigation, but I hoped it stuck. The cold case was closed. The pattern was documented. The abuser was gone. And the system, for all its flaws, had eventually worked. Not because it was designed to, but because a few people had refused to give up and had forced it to. I went back to my normal life. I worked my shifts, paid my rent, and stayed out of HOA drama. But I also stayed on the compliance committee, and I kept the binder because I knew how fast things could go sideways if people stopped paying attention. Sandra had been one person with a clipboard and a badge reel, and she had caused years of damage before anyone stopped her. The next Sandra could be anywhere, and the only way to stop her was to build a system that made it harder for her to operate. Monica and I still met for coffee every few weeks. We talked about the neighborhood, the board, and the state of HOA governance in Oregon. She was working on a proposal to change state law and require independent oversight for all HOAs over a certain size. I thought it was a long shot, but I helped her research the drafting. She said even if it never passed, the process of putting it together was worth it, because it forced people to think about what accountability actually looked like. The Heights at Summit Ridge Association was not perfect. The board still made mistakes. The management company still dropped the ball sometimes. And there were still residents who did not read the rules and then complained when they got fined. But it was better than it had been. And that was enough. One night, about a year after the whole thing started, I was sitting on my couch with my laptop open going through old emails, and I found the first message Sandra had sent me. The one where she said the portal had no record of my submission and I was being fined for non-compliance. I read it again, and I felt the same surge of anger I had felt the first time. But I also felt something else. Satisfaction. Because I had not let her win. I had documented everything. I had found allies. I had pushed back. And I had forced the system to see what she was doing. And in the end, that had been enough. The lesson I took from the whole thing was this: HOAs are only as good as the people who run them. And the people who run them are only accountable if residents make them accountable. Sandra got away with what she did for as long as she did, because most people did not have the time, the energy, or the knowledge to fight back. I had been lucky. I had a job that taught me how to track inconsistencies. I had Monica, who had been through it before and had kept her records. I had the clerk at the clubhouse, who had been quietly documenting Sandra's abuses for months. And I had a lease addendum that gave me a reason to fight instead of just moving out. Not everyone has those advantages. Most people who get targeted by an abusive HOA board just pay the fines, sell the house, and move on. And that is why the abuse continues. Because it works. Because most of the time, no one pushes back. I pushed back. And I won. Not because I was smarter or tougher or more determined than anyone else, but because I had the tools, the allies, and the documentation. And because I refused to let Sandra rewrite the rules to suit her agenda. The funny karma moment came about a month after Sandra was removed. I heard from the acting board president that on her last day she had shown up at the clubhouse to collect some personal items from the compliance office. She had a printed packet of files she was planning to take with her, probably to cover her tracks or set up the same operation somewhere else. But when she stepped outside, a gust of wind hit the parking lot at exactly the wrong moment, and the packet went airborne. Pages scattered across the lot, into the landscaping, and into the street. She chased them for about 10 minutes, and several residents watched from the clubhouse windows. The acting president said it was the most poetic ending he could have imagined. I did not see it myself, but I wished I had. It was the kind of moment that felt like justice, even if it was just coincidence. The policy clarification that destroyed Sandra's favorite tactic came in the form of the 3 motions that were finally implemented. The compliance chair now had to log every violation notice in a shared database with timestamps. Fines over $100 required board review, and tow authorizations required independent verification from the management company. Those 3 changes eliminated the tools Sandra had used to target residents, and they made it almost impossible for anyone else to do the same thing. Karen's credibility collapsed in front of witnesses the moment the altered meeting minutes were exposed at the board meeting. 20 people saw the side-by-side comparison, and several of them spoke up immediately to say they had been at the original meeting and remembered the 3 motions passing. Sandra's story fell apart in real time, and the acting president had no choice but to acknowledge it. After that, no one in the neighborhood trusted anything she said, and the board had to distance themselves from her to preserve their own credibility. The HOA canceled the vendor relationship tied to the abuse within 2 weeks of the investigation. The tow company contract was terminated, and the management company sent a memo to all residents saying future towing would require written authorization from the management office, not the compliance chair. The tow company tried to push back, but the board held firm, and the company eventually accepted the termination and refunded the disputed charges. Sandra's consequences were less clear. She lost her positions, her credibility, and apparently her willingness to stay in the neighborhood. But I never found out if she faced any legal action. The board did not share that information, and I did not push. I had what I needed, my fines refunded, my record cleared, and the system fixed so it could not happen again. The payoff was not just personal. The 3 motions I had fought for were now HOA policy, and they were protecting other residents who did not even know the fight had happened. The compliance committee was reviewing every notice before it went out. The board was holding regular elections, and the management company was finally doing the job they were supposed to be doing all along. It was not a perfect ending. Sandra did not go to jail. She did not have to stand up in a public meeting and apologize. She just left, and the neighborhood moved on. But in a way, that was the most realistic outcome. Most abusers do not get dramatic consequences. They just get stopped, and then they go somewhere else. The victory is not in punishing them. It is in making sure they cannot do it again. I kept working my job, kept living in the neighborhood, and kept serving on the compliance committee. The crisis was over, but the work was not. The system only stayed fixed if people kept maintaining it, and I was willing to be one of those people. Not because I enjoyed it, but because I had seen what happened when no one was paying attention. Monica kept pushing her state law proposal. She presented it to a legislative committee and it got some traction. I do not know if it will ever pass, but the fact that it is being discussed is a win. Change happens slowly, but it happens. The cold case stayed cold in one sense. No one was ever charged with a crime. No one went to court. But in another sense, it was solved. I had reopened the case, gathered the clues, connected the dots, and identified the culprit. And I had used that information to force accountability, even if it was not the kind of accountability that comes with handcuffs and headlines. The investigation taught me that most injustice is not dramatic. It is paperwork. It is timestamps. It is someone changing the rules after the meeting and hoping no one notices. And the way you fight it is not with speeches or protests. It is with documentation, persistence, and the willingness to read the fine print. I had the receipts. And in the end, that was all I needed. The neighborhood still has its problems. There are still petty disputes, still rules that do not make sense, still board members who take things too personally. But the compliance process is transparent now, and that makes all the difference. When someone gets a notice, they know why, they know how to appeal, and they know the board will actually review it. That is not a high bar, but it is higher than it was. I ran into the clerk from the clubhouse a few months later. He thanked me for following through, and he said he had been worried the whole thing would blow up in my face. I told him it almost did, but we had made it work. He said he had been keeping track of how many records requests Sandra had blocked, and the number was over 30 in 2 years. 30 people who had asked for information, been denied, and then either given up or moved out. I asked if he still had the list. He said he did, and he had given it to the management company as part of the investigation. I hoped someone was reaching out to those 30 people and offering them refunds, but I did not follow up. That was someone else's job now. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. A local reporter heard about it and reached out to Monica, and she gave him an interview. The article ran in a community paper and framed it as a case study in HOA accountability. It did not mention my name, which I appreciated, but it did quote Monica saying that residents need to document everything and push back when the system fails. The article got picked up by a few HOA reform blogs, and for a couple of weeks, people were talking about it. Then it faded, the way stories do, and life went back to normal. I kept the external drive with all the evidence in a safe deposit box at my bank. Not because I thought I would need it again, but because I wanted it preserved in case someone else ever did. History matters. Documentation matters. And if another Sandra ever showed up in another neighborhood, I wanted there to be a record of how she was stopped. The Heights at Summit Ridge Association held its first open election in 3 years. 4 seats were up, and 6 people ran. The new board was younger, more diverse, and more engaged. They set up a website with actual transparency, meeting agendas posted in advance, minutes uploaded within a week, financials available on request. It was not perfect, but it was progress. I voted in that election. I did not run, but I voted, and I encouraged other people to vote. Turnout was higher than it had been in years. The acting president, who had handled the Sandra situation reasonably well, was elected to a full term. The new compliance chair won her seat by a landslide. And the board as a whole committed to implementing the oversight policies that had been passed a year earlier. It felt like the story was finally over. Not with a dramatic climax, but with a slow shift toward something better. The abuser was gone. The system was fixed. And the people who had been hurt were getting refunds and apologies. It was not a Hollywood ending, but it was real. And it was enough. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch with a beer, watching the sunset, and my phone buzzed with a text from Monica. It said, "Check the HOA website." I pulled up the site and saw a new page, Compliance Oversight Committee. My name was listed as a member, along with Monica and 2 other residents. There was a link to the committee's charter, which outlined our role, our authority, and our meeting schedule. It was official. We were part of the system now, not fighting against it, but working inside it to make sure it did not fail again. I texted Monica back and said it looked good. She replied, "Now we just have to make sure it stays good." I agreed. That was the hard part. Not fixing the system once, but keeping it fixed. Not winning one fight, but staying vigilant so the next fight never had to happen. I finished my beer and went inside. I had work in the morning, and the story, as far as I was concerned, was done. Sandra was gone. The cold case was solved. The evidence was archived. And the neighborhood was moving forward. That was all I had wanted from the beginning. The final piece of the story came in the mail a week later. It was a letter from the management company attorney, on official letterhead, apologizing for the failures in oversight that had allowed Sandra's conduct to continue for as long as it did. The letter included a check for $500 as compensation for my time, stress, and the costs I had incurred fighting the violations. It also included a statement that the HOA had implemented new training requirements for all board members and staff, and that compliance procedures were being audited quarterly by an independent third party. I deposited the check and kept the letter. It was not an admission of liability, but it was close enough. The management company had acknowledged the problem, and they had committed to fixing it. Whether they would follow through was an open question, but at least they were saying the right things. I thought about Sandra sometimes. I wondered if she had started over somewhere else, if she had learned anything, or if she was running the same playbook in a different neighborhood. I hoped she had not, but I did not lose sleep over it. I had done what I could do. I had documented her abuse, exposed the pattern, and forced accountability. What happened to her after that was not my problem. The lease addendum that had been hanging over me the whole time eventually expired. My landlord offered to renew without the HOA compliance clause, and I signed. I was planning to stay in the neighborhood for at least another year, maybe longer. It had been a rough fight, but I had met good people, learned a lot, and made a difference. That was worth something. Monica and I kept working on the compliance committee. We reviewed notices, flagged inconsistencies, and pushed the board to follow the rules they had written. It was not exciting work, but it mattered. Every notice we caught before it went out was a resident who did not have to go through what I had gone through. Every audit we ran was a check on power that might otherwise go unchecked. It was small-scale, unglamorous accountability, and it was exactly what the neighborhood needed. The Heights at Summit Ridge Association was not perfect, and it never would be, but it was better than it had been, and that was the goal. Not perfection, just progress. One policy, one election, one oversight committee at a time. I appreciate you hearing me out, and I will catch you next time.